They said, "Just stay in your room, Mom. The party's not really your scene anyway." My daughter said it with that same careful smile she uses when she's already decided something and just needs me to agree. I nodded. Of course I did. That's what you do when your daughter speaks to you in that patient, practiced tone. The one meant for people who are old enough to need managing, but not old enough to have stopped noticing. It was Christmas Eve. I had spent 4 days cooking. The standing rib roast had been dry brining since Tuesday. The sweet potato casserole was in the refrigerator, covered in plastic wrap, the kind my late husband Gerald always called the good stuff. I'd made 2 pies, a pecan and a brown butter apple, from scratch, standing on feet that ached by the second hour but didn't quit. I'd set the dining table myself, the long one in the formal room they never used, ironed the linen napkins, polished the candlesticks that had been a wedding gift to Gerald and me 43 years ago. My daughter's name is Diane, her husband is Craig. They have 2 children, a boy named Mason, who is 12, and barely looks up from his phone, and a girl named Sophie, who is 9, and still sometimes holds my hand when we walk. They live in a 4-bedroom house in Scottsdale, Arizona. I am the media with them for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. I know the exact number because I counted. Somewhere around month 18. The way you count the days left in something you're not sure you chose. I moved in after Gerald died. Diane had suggested it, warmly at first. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom. We have the room. The kids would love having you close." And I believed her because I needed to believe someone. Grief does that. It makes you reach for the nearest hand, even if that hand is already full of other things. The first year was manageable. I cooked most nights. I drove Sophie to dance and Mason to his weekly orthodontist appointments when Diane and Craig were busy, which was often. I helped with laundry when the pile got too big. I didn't ask for much. A quiet room, access to the kitchen, and the sense that I was still useful. Somewhere in the second year, useful became invisible. They stopped saying thank you, not all at once, but gradually, the way light fades on a winter afternoon. You don't notice until the room is already dark. Diane began referring to my cooking as convenient. Craig stopped asking how I was sleeping. Sophie still held my hand, but only when no one was watching. Mason had never really started. By December, I had begun to understand something I hadn't let myself think out loud. I was the help. Unpaid, unacknowledged, housed in exchange for services rendered. The Christmas party was for Diane's work friends, a dozen or so people from the marketing firm where she was a director. She'd hired a caterer for the nice food, she said, the kind in little white dishes with garnishes. My roast, my pies, my casserole, those were for the family part, which she seemed to keep scheduling further and further into the future. "You'll be more comfortable upstairs," she said, the afternoon of the party. "These people, they're kind of intense. Word talk, you know how it is." She adjusted one of my candlesticks on the table. The table I had set. "Just relax. You've been on your feet all week." She patted my arm on the way to the kitchen. It wasn't affection, it was management. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in my good green blouse, the one I'd ironed that morning because I thought I'd be at the table, and I listened. Voices below, laughter, the sound of someone's high heels on the hardwood I had mocked 2 days ago, the smell of my own roast drifting up through the vents. I sat there for 5 hours. At some point, Sophie knocked. She opened the door a crack and held out a small plate. "Grandma, I snuck you some pie," she whispered, like she was doing something brave. "The pecan one. It's really good." She'd already eaten a piece herself. Her mouth had a little smear of it at the corner. I thanked her and kissed her forehead. She disappeared back downstairs. I heard Diane say something sharp to her in the hallway, too low to make out the words, but I knew the tone. I set the plate on the nightstand and didn't eat it. I just sat there. There's a particular kind of quiet that happens when you realize something you've been avoiding. Not loud, not dramatic, just a slow, full settling, like a house after a storm. Everything stops moving, and you see clearly what's been there all along. I wasn't a mother here. I wrote the rules, broke them. I wrote the vexture. Something useful like the second refrigerator in the garage. Appreciated when needed, otherwise ignored, never taken anywhere. I went to bed before the party ended. In the morning, the house was quiet in the slow way that follows a late night. Diane's bedroom door was shut. Craig's shoes were by the back door, which meant he'd already left for his Saturday golf. The kitchen looked like a small disaster. Glasses, plates, the picked-over carcass of my roast sitting out on the counter uncovered. I made myself coffee. I stood at the window and watched a hummingbird work its way around the feeder I'd hung on the patio in October. No one had asked me to hang it. I just did it because the yard was bare and I needed something to tend. I thought about the night before for a long time. I thought about the 2 years before that. Then I went to my room and packed a bag, not dramatically, not in a fury. I packed the way you pack when you know exactly what matters and what doesn't. 3 changes of clothes, my medications in the little zip pouch Gerald bought me at an airport in Portland years ago, my reading glasses, the small leather address book I'd kept since 1987, $340 in cash from the envelope in my underwear drawer that I'd been adding to quietly for 8 months, my social security card, and a photograph of Gerald and me on our honeymoon, standing in front of the ocean in Carmel, squinting into the sun and laughing about something neither of us could remember afterward. I left my key on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. I called a rideshare from the end of the driveway, standing in the thin December morning in my coat with my one bag, watching the hummingbird make one more pass at the feeder before it disappeared over the fence. The driver didn't say much. A blessing. I had him take me to the Greyhound station on East Washington. I hadn't been on a bus in decades. The station smelled like old coffee and floor wax and something I couldn't name, but recognized the way you recognize a song from a long time ago. I bought a ticket to Flagstaff, not because I had a plan there, but because Gerald and I had talked about Flagstaff once, years before we ever went. Talked about the ponderosa pines, the way the light came down through them differently than anywhere else, the idea of it cool and tall and quiet above the desert. I had always meant to go back. The bus left at 8:40. I sat by the window and watched Phoenix dissolve into highway and then into something older and wider, the landscape opening up the way certain things do when you stop insisting they stay small. My phone buzzed twice in my coat pocket. I turned it off. I arrived in Flagstaff just after noon. The air hit me first, cold and sharp and full of pine, just like Gerald had said it would be. I stood outside the station with my bag and took 3 long breaths. My hip complained. I didn't rush it. I walked 2 blocks to a diner I could see from the corner, the kind with a hand-painted sign and a specials board in the window. I ordered soup and a grilled cheese and sat at a table by the window and ate all of it, every bite, when the woman behind the counter, early 60s, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a no-nonsense efficiency in the way she moved, came to refill my water. I asked if she knew of any affordable rooms to rent nearby, not a hotel, something longer term. She looked at me for a moment. You moving here or just passing through? I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. She wrote a name and number on a napkin. My neighbor Bev rents a room in her house. Nothing fancy, but she keeps a clean place and she's decent company if you don't mind opinions. I called Bev from the payphone outside. My phone was still off and I intended to keep it that way for a while. She answered on the second ring. 71. A widow. Retired postal worker. The room was $110 a week. Private. Shared bathroom, kitchen use included. I'll need a week up front, she said. And I don't do drama. Neither do I said. Not anymore. She told me to come by at 3. I walked. The cold didn't bother me the way it would have in Scottsdale, where cold meant something apologetic and brief. This cold was honest. It settled into your coat and your bones and reminded you that you were actually somewhere. Bev's house was on a street lined with old pines, a one-story with green shutters and a wind chime that sounded like someone's grandmother's kitchen. She opened the door holding a dish towel and wearing an expression that was evaluating rather than welcoming, which I respected. "You, the one from the diner?" she asked. "Eleanor?" I said. She looked me over. "You're not in trouble with the law, are you?" "No." "Running from a man?" "My daughter," I said, which wasn't exactly right, but it wasn't exactly right, but it wasn't exactly right, but it wasn't exactly wrong either. She nodded, like that explained everything, and stepped back to let me in. The room was small and plain, a twin bed, a quilt in a pattern of deep reds and navy, a window that looked out into the side yard where a bird feeder hung from a post. A pine tree stood close enough that I could hear it when the wind moved. "I'll take it," I said. She handed me a key and showed me where she kept the extra towels. That first night, I lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of a house that wasn't mine. The tick of a baseboard heater, wind high in the pines. Somewhere down the hall, a television playing low. I didn't sleep right away. I just lay there, in the particular quiet of a life not yet filled in, and let myself be still. No one called. No one knew where I was. And for the first time in years, neither of those things frightened me. In the morning, I woke before 7. I dressed quietly and found the kitchen, put a pot of coffee on without being asked. When Bev appeared, she looked at the coffee and then at me. "You do that every morning. You can stay as long as you like." "I intend to," I said. She sat down across from me. We didn't talk much that first morning, but by the second cup we had established the basic outline of each other. I'd been a school librarian for 22 years in Columbus before moving to Arizona with Gerald, then widowed at 68, 2 years in my daughter's house. She'd worked mail delivery for 30 years, raised a son by herself, liked birds and bad crime dramas, and didn't like being told what to do. "Sounds like we've both been told what to do long enough," she said. "More than long enough." By the third day, I was restless in the way that comes from having been busy for so long that stillness feels like a symptom. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings, learning which blocks had dogs and which corners caught the sun. My hip eased with the movement, the cold air putting something back into me that the Arizona heat had been slowly taking out. I passed a small library on Cedar Avenue. I stopped, stood outside for a moment, then went in. The librarian at the front desk was a tired-looking young man in his late 20s who was also trying to answer the phone and shelve a cart at the same time. I asked if they needed any help. He looked at me the way people sometimes look at an unexpected answer to a problem they'd given up on. "Are you a volunteer?" "I could be," I said. "I spent 22 years running a school library. I know the Dewey Decimal System better than my own children's birthdays." He called his supervisor. His supervisor called someone else. By Thursday, I had a schedule. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 4 hours each. Unpaid, but I didn't need money right away. I needed purpose, which is a different currency entirely. Bev approved. "Better than sitting around here getting into my business," she said, which meant she was pleased. The library was small but well-loved, the kind of place where regulars came not just for books, but for the reliable warmth of being somewhere familiar. An older man named Frank came every Tuesday to read the newspapers, all of them in order. A woman named Patricia brought her granddaughter on Thursdays for story time. A teenager named Dahlia came in after school and sat in the back corner and read science fiction novels. She checked out 3 at a time. I learned their rhythms. I remembered what Frank liked. History mostly, anything about the Pacific Theater. I ordered 2 books specifically because I thought Patricia's granddaughter would love them. I started talking to Dahlia about the authors she was burning through. Small things. The kind of small things that add up, quietly, into a life. My phone stayed off through the first week. On the 8th day, I turned it on. It lit up like something in distress. 41 missed calls. 22 messages. The first was from Diane, the morning of Christmas Day, her voice somewhere between worried and furious. "Mom, where are you? We woke up and you were just gone. Call me back immediately." Then Craig, slower, more careful. "Eleanor, we're concerned. Please check in." Then Diane again, louder. Then Craig again. Then silence for a day. Then Diane again. Then the pattern repeating with increasing intensity until around day 5, when the tone shifted. Adam would say this was going too far. My mind briefly confused the names. I meant Craig, not Adam, and the messages changed from frantic to something harder and more controlled. The last message was from my granddaughter Sophie. "Grandma," she said. She was whispering like before, like she was doing something careful. "I don't know where you are, and I really miss you. I saved you a piece of the brown butter pie in the back of the fridge, but no one else knows it's there. I hope you're somewhere nice." A pause. Then, "I love you." "Okay, bye." I played that one twice. I didn't call Diane. I wasn't ready. But that night, I sat down and wrote Sophie a letter. Not my address, not yet. Just a note on Beb's stationery, folded small. I told her I was somewhere with tall trees and cold air and good coffee, and that I was fine, more than fine, and that I missed her too, and that no one was allowed to eat that pie without her permission. I mailed it to the house with no return address. 3 days later, I got a letter back. It arrived addressed to Eleanor, General Delivery, Flagstaff, AZ, a trick I'd mentioned to her once years ago when we were reading a book together about a girl who ran away and sent letters through the old postal system. Sophie had remembered. She'd drawn a picture of a hummingbird on the front of the envelope. Inside, the pie is still there. I'm guarding it. Mason tried to eat it, and I told him it was for you. He made a face, but he left it alone. Mama's been kind of scary. Dad has been quiet. I am the game. I told them you were probably somewhere really good, and they both got a weird look. I miss you every day. Also, the feeder is empty and no one has filled it. I don't know where you keep the food. Love, Sophie. I wrote back the same afternoon. I told her where the hummingbird food was, in the garage, upper left shelf, the red bag. I told her she'd done exactly right about the pie. Then I added, at the bottom, you are the most capable, generous 9-year-old I have ever known. That is not grandmother talk. That is the truth. I went back to the library Tuesday morning and found a book about hummingbirds in the desert Southwest. I set it aside with Sophie's name on a sticky note. At the library, I had begun to notice a man named Garrett who came in on Tuesdays, always at 10, always to the large print section. He was in his early 70s, a former high school principal from outside Sedona, now retired and living with his daughter's family. The same territory in a different house, as he put it once, with a dry humor I recognized. We didn't talk much at first. He checked out his books. I checked them in. We exchanged the kind of pleasantries that over time stop being pleasantries and become something more honest. He mentioned his late wife once. 38 years. She died of a stroke the previous spring, and didn't offer more, which I understood. Some things aren't for sharing until they are. One Tuesday, he asked if I'd eaten lunch. There was a diner 2 blocks north, he said. They made a decent bowl of green chile stew. I said yes before I thought about whether to. We sat for an hour and a half and talked about books, mostly, and the particular challenges of retirement when you'd spent your whole life being needed, and whether the ponderosa pines near his daughter's house were as old as they looked, and what it meant to start over somewhere that didn't already have your history written into the walls. He didn't ask why I was here. I didn't ask about his daughter's house. Some silences are tact, not avoidance. When we walked back to the library, he said, "Same time next week?" "Same time," I said. Bev noticed when I came home. She didn't say anything, just handed me a cup of tea and raised one eyebrow. He's just someone from the library, I said. Sure, she said. She went back to her crime drama. The letters with Sophie continued. She began writing longer ones, 3 pages, then 4. The handwriting loosening as she warmed up, telling me about her friends at school and the injustice of her bedtime and a book she'd found in my old room that she'd started reading. She asked me questions I tried to answer honestly, the way you do when you realize a child is paying real attention. In one letter she asked, "Did you leave because of me? Did I do something wrong?" I wrote back the same night, "You did nothing wrong, not one single thing. I left because I needed to, and because I finally understood that staying somewhere that makes you invisible isn't kindness to anyone, not to the people there, and certainly not to yourself. You will understand this better when you're older. What I want you to know now is this. I left the house, but I did not leave you. Those are 2 completely different things." Then, 6 weeks after I arrived in Flagstaff, a letter came with Scottsdale postmark. Not from Sophie, not from Diane, from my son-in-law Craig. I am the game. I am the game. With Bev's coffee in front of me. It was 2 pages, formal, the kind of writing that someone works on and revises. He acknowledged, which surprised me, that Christmas Eve had not been handled well. He did not blame Diane outright, but the shape of the sentences let me read between them. He said they were worried. He said Sophie asked about me every day. He said Diane had been to 3 therapy sessions, which surprised me further. He ended with, "We would very much like to know that you are safe, and if you're willing, eventually, we'd like to talk." I folded the letter and put it in my nightstand. I didn't respond. Not yet. But I held it differently than I had held Adam's letter. Craig's letter. Less like evidence and more like a door that might, one day, be worth opening. The weeks continued to build. I baked a batch of snickerdoodles for the library's holiday carry-in, and Frank told me they were the best he'd had since his mother made them in 1962. Patricia asked for the recipe. Dahlia, the science fiction teenager, checked out a novel I recommended cautiously, a story about an elderly woman who solves mysteries, and came back 4 days later and stood at the desk and said, with the careful restraint of someone who does not give compliments easily, "That was actually really good." I told her I had 3 more by the same author set aside for her. She tried not to smile and failed. Bev turned 72 in January. I baked her a chocolate cake, devil's food, Gerald's recipe, the one with the coffee and the batter that deepens everything, and set it on the kitchen table with 2 candles and a card that I'd made from a piece of cardstock and some stamps I found at the library's donation table. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a moment. "I told you I didn't want a fuss," she said. "This isn't a fuss," I said. "This is cake. Fuss has decorations." She sat down and ate 2 pieces. We played gin rummy until 10. That night, I lay in the narrow bed and listened to the pines and thought about what my life had felt like 2 years ago and what it felt like now. The ache was still there. Not grief exactly. More like the memory of a shape. Something that used to fit around you and no longer does. But underneath it, something else. Something solid. The way the ground feels different when you trust it. One Thursday, Garrett brought me a small thing, a laminated bookmark with a pressed pine needle behind the clear plastic. He'd made it himself, he said, slightly stiff about it, the way men of a certain age are about anything that might look like sentiment. "You mentioned you like to mark your place," he said. "I had said that weeks ago, in passing." "I do," I said. "Thank you." He nodded and went to the large print section. Later, when he checked out, I was helping someone else, and he just set his books on the counter and left with a small wave. The kind that means something without requiring acknowledgement. I put the bookmark in my current novel that night. 2 months after I arrived, Sophie's letter came with something tucked inside. A folded piece of paper, smaller, in a different handwriting. Careful, uncertain, slanting left. Grandma, Sophie told me where you've been writing to her. I hope that's okay. I'm not going to tell Mom. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not being around more. I know I kind of disappeared when I got older. I don't really have an excuse. I just wanted to say I see it now. I hope you're somewhere good. I think you're somewhere good. Mason. I read it 3 times. Then I wrote him back. I told him I was somewhere with the best green chilla stew he would ever taste, and that I was not keeping score, and that growing up was hard, and 12 was particularly hard, and that not everyone saw things clearly at 12, and it was fine that he hadn't. I told him what I had told Sophie, that leaving the house was not leaving them. I signed it, Grandma, who is also just Eleanor, if that's easier. The snow came that week. I woke to it on a Wednesday morning, 2 inches of it quiet on the pine branches, the yard gone white and still. Bev made oatmeal. Franklin. No, I mean the cat, Bev's cat, a fat orange one named Biscuit, sat on the windowsill and watched the snow with an expression of profound skepticism. You look smug, Bev said, not to the cat. I feel smug, I said. Good, you've earned it. In March, Sophie wrote to tell me that Mason had been filling the hummingbird feeder every week. He hadn't told anyone. She'd caught him doing it, and he'd made her promise not to say anything. I wrote back, don't say a word. Let him have it. In April, I got a letter from Diane. I'd been expecting it, the way you expect weather you've been watching build on the horizon. The envelope was thick. The handwriting was careful, controlled, the way Diane did everything. Inside, 4 pages. She wrote about the holidays, about the morning I left, about what it had felt like to come downstairs and find the key on the counter. She wrote about the therapy, more than Craig had mentioned. She'd been going consistently, she said. She wrote about a conversation she'd had with her own therapist about her mother, and her mother's mother, and the particular way that women in their family had learned to be useful before they learned to be people. She wrote, I think I turned you into the grandmother I wished I'd had growing up, and I forgot to check whether that was also who you were. That was the closest thing to honesty I'd ever expected from her. She didn't ask me to come back. She didn't offer apologies in the transactional way that expects immediate credit. She just said she was sorry. And then she said at the end, if you ever want to talk, I'm here. And if you don't, I understand. But Sophie would like to see you. And so would I, when you're ready. I folded the letter carefully. Bev was in the garden pulling dead stems from last summer's plants. She didn't look up. Good news or bad? Neither, I said. Real news. She grunted. Those are the hardest kind. I sat on the porch step with my coffee and the letter in my lap and thought about the word ready. I had been not ready for a long time. Not ready to say what I needed. Not ready to say what I needed. Not ready to stay gone. And now I was somewhere in the middle, not ready to go back, but perhaps ready to let a door open, just part way, into something different than what was before. I wrote back to Diane. Not the whole letter at once, just the beginning of one. 3 paragraphs. I told her I was safe. I told her I had made something here, not a big life, but a full one that belonged to me. I told her I appreciated what she'd written, that I could hear the work in it. I told her Sophie's letters had kept me warm through the winter. I didn't say I'd come back. I didn't say I wouldn't. I said, let's try something new. No old patterns. No assumptions about whose job it is to give and whose job it is to take. Just 2 people who are related, figuring out what they actually want from each other. I mailed it on a Tuesday. Garrett and I ate lunch at the Green Chilla place 3 times a week now, which Bev claimed she hadn't noticed but definitely had. One afternoon, he told me about his wife. Not the broad strokes, the real things. The way she'd laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. The way she'd reorganized every closet they'd ever owned. The particular quality of silence in the house since she'd been gone. He talked for a long time and I listened without interrupting, which is its own form of care. He didn't ask me to say anything equivalent. He just said, when he was done, I haven't said most of that out loud before. It helps, I said, saying it out loud. He looked out the diner window at the street, at a woman walking a small dog in a plaid coat. You planning to stay in Flagstaff? Yes, I said, not with the certainty of someone who'd always known, but with the certainty of someone who'd decided, which is different and better. He nodded. Good. That was all. But it was enough. That evening, I stood in front of the small mirror in my room and looked at myself for a long moment. Not critically. I was past that, just observingly the way you look at something you've carried a long time and are finally setting down. I looked like a woman who had stood in a kitchen for 5 hours on Christmas Eve and been sent to her room. I also looked like a woman who had gotten on a bus in the dark and found a room in a stranger's house and learned a new town and rediscovered what it felt like to be known for something other than what she could do for others. Both of those things were true. Both of those things were me. I opened the nightstand drawer and took out the photograph of Gerald and me on the beach in Carmel squinting, laughing, the ocean behind us flat and silver in the morning light. I found it, I said to him. Not what I was looking for. Something better? I put the photograph on top of the dresser where I could see it from the bed. Sophie's next letter arrived on a Friday. She'd started a nature journal, she said, writing down every bird she saw in the yard. She had 14 species so far. She included a small drawing of a hummingbird, better than you'd expect from a 9-year-old. The iridescence suggested by careful pencil strokes. At the bottom, she'd written, I think you taught me to notice things, Grandma. I just didn't know that's what was happening. I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote back and told her she was right, and that the best teaching is the kind that happens slowly, without either person realizing the way light works in pine trees. Not a single moment of brightness, but a whole long warming, steady, until you look up and the whole day has changed. I taped her drawing of the hummingbird to the inside of my dresser drawer, behind the recipe cards. Next to the note I'd written to myself on the night I first understood that leaving was not the same as losing. That sometimes the thing you most needed to find was only visible once you'd stop standing in your own shadow. I am 67 years old. I work 4 mornings a week in a library in Flagstaff, Arizona. I live in a room in a house that smells like pine and old books and Bev's overambitious cooking. I have a bookmark made by a man who brought it without ceremony and asked for nothing in return. I have a granddaughter who guards pie and draws birds and writes letters in the old-fashioned way because her grandmother taught her it mattered. I wasn't sent away. I wasn't discarded. I walked out a door that had always been open. I just needed someone to stop standing in front of it. That someone turned out to be me. And if any part of this found you at the right moment, if you have been sitting in a room upstairs, listening to a party that doesn't include you, eating a piece of your own pie alone, I want you to know this. The bus runs every morning. The room is always smaller than you expect and larger than you need. And the life on the other side of leaving is nothing like what you imagined, because it's real and yours and it's already waiting. Come back and tell me when you find it. I'll be here. There is a version of this story where I stayed, where I came downstairs the next morning, made coffee for everyone, smiled at Diane's work friends on their way out, wrapped the leftover roast, and went on being the woman no one remembered to include, but everyone expected to be there. I know that version well. I lived it for 2 years and 3 months. But something shifts when you finally hear yourself clearly. Not the voice that says, be patient, be useful, be grateful for the roof. The other voice. The one that has been waiting, very quietly, for you to stop talking over it. I did not leave that morning because I was angry. I left because I had finally stopped being afraid of what leaving meant. That is the difference between a reaction and a decision. Reactions come from pain. Decisions come from understanding. And what I understood standing at that kitchen window watching the hummingbird work the feeder I had hung because no one else thought to, was that I had been pouring myself into containers that were never meant to hold me. What you tolerate, you teach. Not intentionally, not cruelly. But every time I accepted the pat on the arm, the careful smile, the room upstairs, I was teaching the people around me that this was acceptable, that Eleanor could be set aside, that her presence was logistical, not personal. I am not bitter about that. I was part of it too. I had learned long before Diane that being needed was the safest way to be loved. When you make yourself indispensable, no one sends you away. Or so you believe. Until the night you are sitting alone with a piece of your own pie while the party you cooked for carries on 5 floors below you. The thing about starting over at 67 is that you have no patience left for pretending. You know too much about time to waste it performing a version of yourself that keeps other people comfortable. Flagstaff was not a plan. It was an honest answer to a question I had been avoiding for years. What do I actually want? Not what is expected of me. Not what keeps the peace. What do I want? The answer turned out to be tall pines, cold air, work that uses my hands and my mind. A room that is mine. A friend who passes the last cookie without making it mean something. A granddaughter who draws hummingbirds and guards pie and writes letters the old-fashioned way, because someone taught her that slow things have value. The cause was never really Christmas Eve. The cause was 2 years of becoming invisible, one small accommodation at a time. The effect was a woman who finally, at 67, remembered that she had a self worth protecting. And once you remember that, you cannot unknow it. Diane is doing the work now, so is Craig. Even Mason, who never seemed to notice anything, has been filling the hummingbird feeder every week in silence. People change when the mirror they have been avoiding is suddenly, unmistakably gone. I did not set out to teach anyone anything. I just stopped making myself small enough to be convenient. And it turns out that was the most instructive thing I ever did. I am not waiting for anything now. Not for permission, not for an apology that says the right words in the right order, not for someone to finally see my value and announce it. I see it. That is enough. That has always been enough. I just needed to get quiet enough to hear it. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. The life you want is not somewhere ahead of you, waiting for the right circumstances. It is available right now, on the other side of one honest decision. The bus runs every morning. You already know which direction to go.